Something inside your home has already changed, and no one announced it. It didn't come through a broken door. It didn't force its way in. It was welcomed, quietly, almost invisibly. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Because the most destructive influences don't arrive looking like threats. They arrive disguised as normal, as harmless habits, as just the way things are now. But if you've been feeling a subtle shift, less peace, more tension, a strange heaviness that doesn't seem to have a clear source, this is not random. There are influences that, once inside a house, begin to reshape everything from the inside out. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, consistently, strategically. They don't just affect the atmosphere. They affect decisions, they affect relationships, they affect the way you think, the way you react, the way you live. And most people never realize it's happening. They think it's stress. They think it's personality. They think it is just a phase. But what if it isn't? What if there are specific patterns, already identified long ago, that were never meant to coexist with peace, wisdom, and stability inside a home? Because there's something most people ignore. Your home is not just a physical space. It's a spiritual environment. A place where values are reinforced, where patterns are repeated, where unseen forces gain permission through small, consistent choices. And once something gains access, it doesn't stay neutral. It either builds or it erodes. There's no middle ground. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because some of the influences that damage a home the most are the ones people defend the hardest. They justify them. They normalize them. They protect them, even when the consequences are already visible. A shift in behavior, a loss of clarity, a growing distance between people who used to feel connected. And instead of asking what entered, people adapt to what changed. That's how it spreads. Not through force, but through acceptance. Pay attention to this. There were moments in history where entire households, entire communities, began to collapse from the inside. Not because of external attacks, but because of what they allowed to remain within their own walls. And the pattern is always the same. It starts small, almost invisible, easy, until it's no longer small, until it begins to define the environment itself. And by that point, most people are no longer questioning it. They're living inside it. So now the real question isn't whether these influences exist. The real question is, have they already entered your home without you noticing? Because what comes next is not just information. It's recognition. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. What no one tells you is that nothing enters a home by accident. Not the atmosphere, not the patterns, not even the tension you can't quite explain. Everything that settles inside your house, at some point, was allowed in. Not always consciously, not always intentionally, but through small permissions that felt insignificant at the time. That's how it begins. No one wakes up one day and decides to invite something harmful into their home. It doesn't work like that. It comes through gradual openings, moments where discernment is lowered, where something is accepted because it seems harmless, convenient, or simply normal. And this is where most people lose awareness, because they're not watching the door, they're watching the outcome. Too late. A conversation that once felt light starts carrying a different tone. A habit that once seemed innocent begins to shape behavior. A presence, an influence, slowly becomes part of the environment, and no one questions it. Why? Because it didn't arrive with warning signs. It blended in. It adapted to the rhythm of the house. It became familiar, and familiarity is one of the most dangerous forms of permission. When something becomes familiar, it stops being examined, it stops being filtered, it just stays. Think about this carefully. There are things people allow into their homes every single day, through what they watch, through what they listen to, through what they tolerate, through what they repeat without thinking. And each one of those is not just an action, it's an opening, an agreement, a quiet yes that echoes deeper than most realize. Because a home is shaped by what is consistently present within it. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And once something is consistently present, it begins to influence. Not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. It starts to guide reactions, to shift priorities, to normalize what once felt out of place. And the most subtle part of all is that the people inside the home begin to adjust, without noticing. They don't see it as change. They see it as life. This is where the real danger is. Not in the influence itself, but in the permission that made it possible. Because once a door is opened repeatedly, it stops feeling like a door. It feels like part of the structure, and at that point, closing it becomes uncomfortable, even when everything inside the house is already being affected. So before looking at what these influences are, you need to understand this first. They didn't force their way in. They were allowed. And once something is allowed, it doesn't remain passive. It begins to take space. And eventually, it begins to take control. The first two influences don't look dangerous at all. In fact, they're the ones almost everyone has already allowed inside. And that's exactly why they're the most common. The first one is subtle, but once you see it, you realize how present it is. It's the influence of constant noise. Not just sound, but mental noise. Distraction that never stops. Voices that never pause. Content that fills every quiet moment so completely that there's no space left to think clearly. It looks normal. A screen always on. Something playing in the background. Scrolling just to pass time. But here's what happens over time. Silence disappears. And with it, discernment begins to fade. Because clarity is born in stillness. Scripture reveals this in a way most people overlook. Be still and know that I am God. Stillness is not optional. It's where awareness is restored. But when a home is filled with constant input, there is no stillness. And when there is no stillness, there is no reflection. And when there is no reflection, people stop questioning what they're rehaluin. In look at a normal day. Someone wakes up, reaches for the phone, fills the morning with noise, moves through the day without a single moment of silence, ends the night the same way, and then wonders why there's anxiety, confusion, lack of direction. It's not random, it's accumulation. The second influence feels even more justified. It's the normalization of negativity inside the home. Small comments, sarcasm, complaints that seem harmless in the moment, but repeated every day, they begin to shape the environment. A frustrated tone becomes the default. Gratitude becomes rare. Peace becomes fragile. And no one notices when the shift happens. Because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in conversations like this. A simple complaint at dinner. A negative comment about someone else. A sarcastic remark that gets a laugh, but leaves a trace. Again, and again, and again, until it becomes the language of the house. There is a warning about this that most people underestimate. The tongue has the power of life and death. Not metaphorically. Practically. What is spoken repeatedly creates atmosphere. An atmosphere shapes behavior. Now imagine a home where the dominant language is complaint, criticism, or frustration. Even if nothing dramatic happens, the environment slowly shifts. People become more reactive, more defensive, less patient, and relationships begin to feel heavier, without a clear reason. This is how it works. Not through one big moment, but through repetition. Through what is allowed to be said, and left uncorrected. And this is where most people miss it. They're not dealing with a problem. They're living inside a pattern. A pattern created by two influences that seemed completely harmless. Constant noise and constant negativity. Individually, they feel small. Together, they reshape the entire atmosphere of a home. And once that atmosphere changes, everything inside it begins to respond accordingly. The third influence goes deeper than noise, deeper than words. Because it doesn't just shape the atmosphere of the house, it reshapes the identity of the people living inside it, and almost no one recognizes it while it's happening. It's the slow acceptance of distorted identity. Not a sudden change, not a dramatic shift, but a gradual disconnection from who you were, into a version shaped by pressure, comparison, and silent expectations. It begins quietly. Someone starts adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict, starts saying less, holding back more, choosing peace on the surface, at the cost of truth underneath. At first, it feels like maturity, like wisdom, but over time, something starts to disappear. Clarity, conviction, authenticity, and the most dangerous part, no one calls it distortion. They call it adaptation. There's a warning about this that cuts deeper than it seems. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This isn't just about the outside world. It applies to any environment, including your own home. Because when a house begins to reward silence over truth, approval over integrity, comfort over alignment, people inside it begin to conform. Look at how this plays out in everyday life. A person feels something is wrong, but says nothing. Sees a pattern that's unhealthy, but ignores it, not because they don't know, but because speaking would create discomfort. So they adjust, they smile when they disagree. They agree when they feel resistance. They shrink, little by little, to maintain peace, and over time, that version becomes normal. The original voice fades. This is where tension rises. Because now, the house may look calm on the outside, but internally, something is fractured. People are present, but not fully themselves. Conversations happen, but without depth. There's interaction, but not real connection. And no one understands why it feels empty. Because the issue is not conflict. The issue is suppressed truth. Another passage reveals something critical. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Identity is formed internally, and whatever is consistently suppressed begins to reshape that identity. So if someone constantly silences their own perception, their own conviction, eventually, they stop trusting themselves. And once trust is lost internally, every external influence becomes stronger. That's why this influence is so dangerous. It doesn't attack loudly. It rewrites quietly. It teaches people to disconnect from their own discernment, until they no longer question what feels wrong. And once that happens, the home no longer needs external pressure, because the distortion is already internal. And when distortion becomes internal, it no longer feels like distortion. It feels like reality. The fourth influence doesn't stay in the mind. It moves into the structure of the home itself. It begins to affect how people relate, how they respond, how they connect, and eventually, how they drift apart. This is the influence of spiritual neglect, disguised as routine. Not rejection of faith, not open resistance. Something much quieter, a slow fading of intentionality. Moments that once had meaning begin to disappear. Time that was once set apart becomes optional. Priorities shift. Not dramatically, but gradually. And no one notices the exact moment it changed, because nothing broke. It just weakened. There's a pattern that repeats itself in many homes. Days become full. Schedules become heavy. And anything that doesn't demand urgency gets pushed aside. Reflection is delayed. Prayer becomes occasional. Gratitude becomes rare. Not because people don't believe, but because they stop engaging. And this is where the environment begins to shift again. Because when spiritual awareness fades, other influences fill the space. There's a warning that speaks directly into this. Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. Watch and pray. Not once. Not when convenient, consistently, because neglect creates vulnerability. Now look at how this plays out in everyday life. A family sits together, but each person is disconnected. There's presence, but no unity. Conversations become small conflicts escalate faster than they used to, and no one links it back to the root. They think it's as personality. They think it's stress. But what if it is something deeper? Because a home without intentional alignment doesn't stay neutral. It drifts, slowly, but inevitably. Another passage reveals the consequence clearly. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. Division doesn't always come from major conflict. Sometimes it comes from lack of foundation, from misalignment that grows quietly, until unity no longer holds. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most families don't break in one moment. They fragment over time, through distance, through distraction, through lack of shared direction. Think about the small moments, a disagreement that isn't resolved, a conversation avoided, a habit of isolation growing inside the same space. Each one seems minor, but together they begin to redefine the household. Where there was once connection, there is now distance. Where there was once patience, there is now irritation. And it doesn't feel like something entered. It feels like something left. Peace, clarity, presence, gone. Not suddenly, but gradually. That's what makes this influence so dangerous. It doesn't destroy loudly, it dissolves quietly. And by the time the effects are visible, most people are already living inside the consequences, not understanding how the environment changed, only feeling that it did. The fifth influence is the one almost no one wants to face. Not because it's hard to understand, but because it's too close, too personal, too real. It's not something outside the house. It's something that grows inside the people living in it. It's the quiet tolerance of what you already know is wrong. Not ignorance, not confusion, awareness, without action. That moment when something feels off, but you ignore it. When a behavior crosses a line, but you let it pass. When a pattern repeats, and instead of confronting it, you adapt to it. This is where everything shifts, because at this point, it's no longer about what entered. It's about what is being allowed to stay. There's a warning that cuts directly into this. Whoever knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, sins. Not doing what is right is not neutral. It creates space. And that space gets filled. This is where the influence becomes invisible, because nothing new needs to come in anymore. The damage continues. Through permission. Look at how this unfolds in real life. Someone notices a toxic pattern in the house, but says, it's not the right time. Someone feels disrespected, but chooses silence to avoid conflict. Someone sees a habit growing, and thinks, it's not that serious, and each time, a small line is crossed. Not dramatically, but consistently. And this is where vulnerability appears, because deep down, people know. They feel it. That quiet discomfort, that inattention that says, this isn't right. But confronting it would require courage. It would require honesty. It would require disrupting what has already become normal. So instead, they wait, they tolerate, they adjust, and over time, they become part of what they once questioned. Another passage reveals the deeper danger. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. It only takes a small allowance to influence everything. Not immediately, but inevitably. Now imagine a home where this pattern repeats. Truth is shown, but not spoken. Boundaries are needed, but not established. Changes are required, but constantly postponed. The environment doesn't explode. It slowly reshapes itself around compromise, and the people inside begin to lose something essential. Not just peace, not just clarity. Authority. The ability to stand firm, to say no, to protect what should be protected. Because every time something is tolerated, authority weakens. And once authority weakens, everything else becomes negotiable. This is the hardest part to admit, because it removes the illusion that the problem is external. It reveals something uncomfortable, that sometimes the greatest influence inside a home is not what came from outside. It's what was allowed from within. And that realization is not easy, because it means responsibility. It means acknowledging that change doesn't begin out there. It begins here with what you accept, with what you ignore, with what you choose not to confront. And once you see that clearly, you can go back to not seeing, because now it's no longer hidden. Now, it's a decision. There comes a moment when everything becomes clear. Not gradually, but all at once. When you stop looking at symptoms and finally see the source. And that realization changes something inside you. Because now you understand. Nothing in your home changed by accident. Nothing stayed without permission. Nothing grew without repetition. And, for the first time, you see where it all began. Not outside, but in the small moments that were ignored. The patterns that were tolerated. The silence that replaced truth. And this is where the shift happens. Not in the house first, but in you. Because restoration doesn't start with removing everything at once. It starts with one decision. To stop allowing what you already know shouldn't be there. There's a principle that brings everything back into alignment. Submit yourselves, then, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Submit and resist. 2 actions, not passive, not theoretical, intentional. Because protection is not built through awareness alone. It's built through boundaries, through what you allow and what you no longer accept. Now think about your home again. Not as a place you live, but as an environment you are responsible for shaping. What stays? Because you've allowed it. What repeats? Because no one has interrupted it. What feels wrong, but has never been confronted? This is where change becomes practical. You begin to remove what feeds noise. You begin to interrupt patterns of negativity. You begin to speak where silence once dominated. Not aggressively, but clearly, because clarity restores order, and order restores peace. There's another truth most people overlook. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. But once there is knowledge, destruction is no longer inevitable. Because now you see, and once you see, you can act. This is the turning point, where the house stops drifting and starts being directed again, where the atmosphere is no longer shaped by habit, but by intention, where what enters is filtered, and what remains is chosen, and something begins to return. Not instantly, but noticeably. Lightness, clarity, a sense that the environment is no longer working against you, but aligning with you. This is not about perfection. It's about awareness, followed by action. Because the same way those influences entered, they can be removed. The same way patterns were formed, they can be broken. And the same way the environment shifted, it can be restored. But only when someone decides that what happens inside that house is no longer accidental. It's intentional. And from that moment on, everything begins to change.